Hi, my name is Jake, and I am a bookish drummer. So for this video, I will be talking about my top 10 favorite authors of all time. In one sense, this list was easy to make because coming up with my top 10 list was fairly easy, like choosing 10 authors to be in my top 10 list. That was easy. The hard part was, of course, ranking all of them. Not my top, I guess my top 3 has always been the same for like the past 5 years or so. Like they have been pretty consistently my favorite authors. But everyone else is just very hard to like rank, and it can be kind of arbitrary at times. Like there's not really a big difference between like number 10 and number 7 per se. But yeah, I'm just going to go ahead and do this video, and these are my top 10 favorite authors of all time. And without further ado, let's go ahead and jump right into it. And for number 10 on my list, I'm going to have to go with Zoe Stage, one of my favorite horror writers. And she makes the list even though quantitatively she doesn't have very many books. She has 3 novels, with one coming out next year and a novella that I've read. But qualitatively, all of her books have been terrific, including this one of my favorite horror books of all time, Wonderland, and Baby Teeth, also one of my favorite books of all time. She just has a really good way of getting into the minds of the characters, getting into the heads of the characters and their psychology. Like her books are definitely more on the psychological side of horror, especially with something like this, where you have a family in a closed, isolated setting in the middle of winter in a storm, and it's got a lot of Shining vibes, and it's just really good. And with all of her books, her characters are the standout element in all of them. For me, Zoe Stage is definitely one of the most underrated horror writers writing today. If you go on Goodreads, especially with something like Wonderland, this has a very low rating. And even Baby Teeth, one of her most famous novels, is fairly low. But I really like her. I love her writing style. And I'm definitely going to continue reading her with the more books she comes out with. Like I said, she has 3 novels and a novella. I've loved all of them. And I can't wait to read Mothered by her. And actually, I've got an advanced reader copy, so I'm going to be reading that probably in October. Good time to read her books. And yeah, Zoe Stage, even though, like I said, quantitatively she only has a few books, I had to include her just because how much I love her writing style and her character work. And yeah, she's one of my favorite authors, and she will probably climb up the list the more she puts out. And yeah, Zoe Stage comes in at number 10 on the list. Coming in at number 9 on the list, we have Stephen Graham Jones, another horror author. And Stephen Graham Jones is definitely a newer addition to the list. I started reading his books last year, probably in June, and I started out with The Only Good Indians, and ever since then I've read a lot of his books, and they've been pretty good for the most part. And he's just consistently really good at writing very interesting and very unique horror stories. For example, with The Only Good Indians, this was the first book I read by him, and it was such a unique experience reading his books. His books don't read like anyone else. He definitely has one of the most unique voices I've ever read from any author. I also think he has the unique ability to write not only just good thematic horror, like with this one you could definitely tell there's a theme going on in this book, but then he's also able to write stuff like Zombie Bake Off, which has pretty much no theme, and you just read it just because it's funny and fun and very entertaining. He has the ability to do both, which I really appreciate. He also has the ability to not only write good novels, but he can also write good novellas and good short stories, which when we get to my top 2 favorite authors, they definitely have that ability too. So that's a huge reason why Stephen Graham Jones will probably be climbing this list as well when I read more of his works. But yes, Stephen Graham Jones has made the list now because of his unique voice, and his unique ability to tell a very interesting horror story. And his character work is really good in all of his works. And he's just a very interesting writer, and I really want to read more of his stuff. And I'm sure when I do, like I said, he'll climb up the list. But for now, he comes in at number 9 on the list. And number 8 on my list, we have Dan Wells, who is the author of I Am Not a Serial Killer, and he's the author of the John Cleaver series, and one of my favorite series of all time. I think he's a terrific writer. And the main reason why Dan Wells made my list is because of John Cleaver and the John Cleaver series, because he's one of the most unique characters with one of the most unique voices of any character that I've ever read. He's easily one of my favorite protagonists or anti-heroes or whatever you want to call him. John Cleaver, one of the best I've ever read. And if you haven't read it, I highly recommend starting with I Am Not a Serial Killer, just checking it out, and it's so good. So like I said, Dan Wells is mainly on this list because of my love for John Cleaver, but he also has a few standalones that I really enjoy. The Hollow City was pretty good. Not fantastic, I did have a couple issues with it, but still really good. Very interesting and weird horror story, but also one of my favorite horror standalones of all time. Severely underrated is Extreme Makeover. And if you haven't heard of this story and you don't know what it's about, it's essentially a post-apocalyptic tale, and it's about the end of the world that's caused by cosmetics, which probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but when you start out and you get into it, it makes a lot of sense, and it's hilarious. It's essentially a satire, but it's got a lot of great horror elements into it woven in. It's got a lot of great thriller elements. It's got great characters. It's really funny. It's just so good, and I want everyone to go check it out. But that's a huge reason why Dan Wells is on this list. John Cleaver, Extreme Makeover, and I really want to go back and read some of his YA. I haven't read it yet, but I'm hoping that I'm gonna like that too. But yeah, like I said, the main reason he's on this list is my love for John Cleaver. Dan Wells, fantastic writer. He comes in at number 8 on the list. And coming in at number 7 on the list, we have one of my all-time favorite sci-fi writers. He's responsible for writing probably my favorite trilogy of all time, and that would, of course, be Sylvain Neville. And the trilogy that I'm talking about is The Themis Files. My favorite trilogy of all time. I'd give all those books in that trilogy 5 stars. And this is actually his newest book, which is the second book in his new trilogy, Take Them to the Stars. It's not quite as good as The Themis Files, but it's still really good, and I can't wait for the third book to come out. And I recently read this, and I really enjoyed it. But yeah, the reason he's on the list is because of his unique ability to actually write sci-fi that I like. A lot of the times when I read sci-fi, it's interesting and the concepts are cool, but a lot of the times the sci-fi authors forget to include compelling characters or compelling character development, especially with classic sci-fi. Modern sci-fi authors are getting better at it, but I think Sylvain Neville has pretty much perfected it. I love his fast-paced, almost sci-fi thriller type of writing style, along with the terrific characters that he interweaves in the story. I think he's terrific, and I can't wait to read the third book, like I said. And like I said, Themis Files, it's such great character work, along with having these really cool and out there sci-fi ideas. That's the kind of sci-fi I like, and yeah, he pretty much is my favorite sci-fi author, besides another person, so we'll get to that later on in the list. But yeah, Sylvain Neville, number 7 on the list, terrific. At number 6 on my list, we have my all-time favorite short story author. And I know a lot of people don't love short stories, but I particularly like short stories, and he is by far my favorite. He is the king of short stories for me. And enough beating around the bush. Number 6 is Ray Bradbury. Look at that man. King of short stories, I tell you. King of short stories. I've read probably a dozen or maybe even more of his short story collections, and I've loved all of them. So I've probably read up to like 200, 250, maybe like 300 of his short stories. Even though, a lot of them are really good, but even the ones that aren't like great, I still get something out of all of them, which says something. And his short stories are just so imaginative and so creative, and they're just like little pockets of stories. I know some people, when they read short stories, they read it and they're like, oh, it was good, but I wanted more. Where I'm the exact opposite. Like, if you can tell a really good story in like 10 or 15 pages, like, you are a fantastic writer in my mind. And he does that very often. Probably my favorite by him would be like The Illustrated Man, but I also love this one, which is one of his newer ones he released before he died. We'll Always at Paris. And he's got ones like The October Country, Driving Blind, Quicker Than the Eye. Like, he's just got so many great short story collections that not a lot of people have actually read. But I don't know if you can see it, but it's not in frame. But like, I have a ton of Ray Bradbury stuff, and I want to read more of him. I haven't read everything he's written, but I plan on it. And like I said, he's just the king of short stories. And that's the main reason why he's on the list, is because while some of these authors ahead of him also write short stories in novellas, I think he is the master of the short story. And yeah, for that reason, he is number 6 on the list. All right, now we're cracking into my top 5 people, my top 5 favorite authors of all time. And for number 5, this is an author that I started to read last year, and I was pleasantly surprised by how much I loved her writing style. And with every book that I read by her, she just keeps moving up and up the list. And without further ado, number 5 is Taylor Jenkins Reid. Last year, I started reading her books, and of course, I started with Daisy Jones and the Six, which is still one of my all-time favorite books. And that book really worked for me because it dealt with music and classic rock and band drama. So I was worried that might have been a one-hit wonder. But then after that, I read Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, which was just about, a woman talking about her love life. And I was like, I still love it because of her amazing ability to write compelling characters. And then I read Malibu Rising, loved it, gave it 5 stars. And I just kept reading more of her books. I think I've read 5 books by her now, and all but one of them have been 5 stars. And they're all different stories, and just in every one of them, she has the very unique ability to blend comedy and drama so well. And her character works are so good, and just some of my favorite characters of all time. Very real and believable characters. And yeah, I love her for all of those reasons. And I can't wait to read Carrie Soto is Back. Easily one of my most anticipated releases of 2022. I think it's supposed to be somewhat of a sequel to Malibu Rising, if I remember correctly. But yeah, I absolutely love her writing. And basically all of her books from here on out, I'm going to put in 5-star predictions, because she just is an amazing writer. And for all of those reasons, and probably more that I'm forgetting, number 5, Taylor Jenkins Reid. And number 4 on my list, I'm going to have to go with Lisa Jewell, one of my all-time, well, actually, not one of, she is my favorite mystery thriller writer of all time. And I love all of her books. I think I've read 8 of her books, and I've given all but one of them 5 stars, and the one that I didn't give 5 stars, it was 4.5 stars. Everything I read by her is just terrific. And I have several reasons why she's one of my favorite authors of all time. Her character work is great, and I love the way she structures her books. She often has multiple timelines when you're following 2 or 3 people, and you're jumping back and forth between their perspectives, and the story is kind of weaving in slowly, and like I said, often in non-linear timelines, which is one of my favorite tropes of all time. And just the way she structures her novels and the atmosphere which she creates with her mystery is so good. And for me, even though she does write mysteries and thrillers, I don't read her books because, like, I really want to know, like, a big twist. Like, that's not really why her books are great. Her books are great because of her characters and the way she weaves them into the story and the atmosphere and just the slow buildup of what's inevitably going to come. I love her books for all of those reasons, and she's definitely an author that I highly anticipate every year reading a new book from. And she has a new book coming out called The Family Remains, which is actually the sequel to one of my other favorite books by her, The Family Upstairs. And I for sure seeing that being a 5-star book. And interestingly enough, she also has books that she wrote before she became like a very famous mystery thriller writer. A lot of those are more like contemporary and romance books, but I still want to try to read them just to see if I will still like them. I mean, you never know. I could love those as well. But yeah, she's just an amazing author. Great character work, non-linear timelines, very interesting structures, just terrific atmosphere with all of her books. I just love everything she writes, and she quickly rose on my level of the top 10 authors list. And for right now, she sits at number 4 on the list. But don't be surprised if she overtakes one of these authors in the near future. And now we're cracking into my top 3. And essentially, this top 3 list has been the same for about 6 or 7 years or so. Like, ever since I started reading these 3 authors back when I got into college and started actually reading for fun, like, these authors have always stuck with me. I've always read their stuff, and just not really much has changed since then. For number 3, I'm going to have to go with Brando Sando, aka Brandon Sanderson. So for me, I started reading Sanderson right after I finished A Song of Ice and Fire, and I just had an itch to read another huge epic fantasy series. So I went to Barnes & Noble and just picked out a random book, like very thick paperback fantasy book, and it happened to be The Way of Kings by Brandon Sanderson. I jumped into that sucker not knowing anything about Sanderson or the Cosmere and just absolutely fell in love with it. And then ever since then, I've been reading Sanderson quite regularly, and I've loved almost everything that's in the Cosmere. He's just one of my favorite authors. Stormlight Archive is easily one of my favorite fantasy series of all time. His magic systems are really cool. His plots are very intricate. He has very cool characters. Just all across the board, Sanderson is just terrific. One of my favorite fantasy authors of all time. And of course, he's very popular, so I'm sure a lot of y'all watching this video have read his stuff before. Probably the main reason he's not in my top 2 is because while he does write good novels within the Cosmere, I'm not a huge fan of some of his short stories and novellas. There is one called The Emperor's Soul that's really good. But other than that, like, a lot of the stories that's in Arcanum Unbounded aren't that great. I don't really think he's a terrific short story novella writer. And also, a lot of his, like, YA stuff isn't on par with the Cosmere, at least in my mind. Besides the Arithmetist. I really like the Arithmetist. But basically, my love for Sanderson is the Cosmere. I love the Cosmere, especially Stormlight. Stormlight is probably my main love for Sanderson, which is why he's so high up on the list. And yeah, for all of those reasons, Sanderson comes in at number 3 on the list. And now for my top 2. You guys probably know who is in my top 2. And then for those of you who are a fan of my channels and watch a particular brand of my videos, you'll probably be surprised at who is number 2 on the list and who is not number 1. And number 2 on the list is Stephen King. I started reading Stephen King back in college when I heard the news about Dr. Sleep coming out, which was, of course, the sequel to The Shining, and which is one of my favorite horror movies of all time. So I quickly picked up a copy of The Shining, read that, loved it, moved on to Dr. Sleep, loved that too, And the rest is history. I've essentially read everything the man has written. And while I don't love everything he's written, he has some bad books. The majority of his books I do enjoy reading, and I do really like his writing style. And I love his character works, has some very interesting ideas. And I love the fact that he's not a cookie cutter author, in which I mean he doesn't write the same book over and over again. And you can tell because a lot of the authors who do that, like you go to Barnes & Noble and like all of their books are essentially the same length. But for Stephen King, you could read a book like Carrie, which is like 200 pages, or you could read a book like It, which is 1,100 pages, and then a book like Doomakey, which is like 700 pages. So clearly he has different ideas and different stories that he wants to tell, different characters he wants to create. I love him for that. And also, he has the unique ability to write great novels, novellas, and short stories. And obviously, you guys who are fans of my channel, I love Stephen King, and you guys know that because I make a lot of Stephen King content. And so I don't feel the need to go into too much more detail. But yeah, Stephen King is my second favorite author of all time. But who does that leave for number one, you ask? My number one favorite author of all time is George R.R. Martin. And you guys might be surprised because of the amount of Stephen King content that I make on the channel. But the reason why George doesn't get a lot of attention for me is simply because I love everything that he writes. And it would literally just be me gushing about his works all the time. Like, there's not much I could say about A Song of Ice and Fire, my all-time favorite fantasy series, that hasn't been said before. That's why I don't make a lot of George content, but I still love him anyway. And, Stephen King, even though he's my second favorite author, he has a lot of bad books, which makes for very interesting, unpopular opinions and interesting discussions. Whereas for George, I love everything. Like, I love all of his books. Not to the same extent as A Song of Ice and Fire necessarily, but after reading A Song of Ice and Fire and him quickly becoming my second favorite author besides Stephen King, I went back and read all of his other stuff, and a lot of people aren't even aware of his 70s and 80s stuff, which I think is really good. It's basically sci-fi and horror that he told in the 70s and 80s that at the time were, they were not really popular, but they won a lot of Hugo and Nebula awards. He's won more awards for his sci-fi than he has for A Song of Ice and Fire, which is pretty crazy. But like I said, after going back and reading all of those, he quickly became my number one favorite author. And like with Stephen King, he's able to write novels, novellas, and short stories. And for me, even though I would say like Ray Bradbury is my all-time favorite short story author, and Stephen King and Brandon Sanderson are terrific at writing novels, George can really do it all, and he does it very consistently. And I just love, like I said, I love everything the man writes. There's not really any real complaints I have with him. I think he's a terrific world builder for fantasy. He's probably got some of my all-time favorite characters. He's such a terrific character writer. And then, with his sci-fi and horror, he just comes up with these really weird and out there ideas. And just, there's not a lot of stuff I can complain about with him. Whereas some of my other, even though, a lot of these authors that are in my top 10 list, they have written some books that I don't like from them, or they're just not on the same level as George, is what I'm trying to say. George is my favorite author, and it's going to take a lot for someone to dethrone him. I really don't think anyone will. I mean, it would be interesting to see if they could, but I'm pretty sure George is here to stay as my all-time favorite author. So yeah, coming in at number one, Georgie boy. Okay, so that is my top 10 favorite authors list. My all-time favorite authors. Please let me know down in the comments below what you think of my list. Are some of these authors also your favorite authors? Or have you not read some of these authors? Either way, please let me know down in the comments below. Also, who are your favorite authors of all time? I'd love to chat with you down in the comments below. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to my YouTube channel and the Book Astronomer Discord. And if you'd like to further support me financially, go check out my Patreon page and see what that's all about. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching and have a terrific day. I also just want to quickly mention some of my honorable mentions, authors that sit just outside of my top 10. And an author that used to be in my top 10 is Agatha Christie. But I took her out of the list just because quantitatively she has written a lot of books. I've read like 45 of her books, but I wouldn't necessarily say that I've loved a lot of them compared to some of my other authors that are now in my top 10 list. So even though she's one of my favorites, qualitatively, not so much. And the author that I really wanted to put in my top 10 list, who would now sit at my number 11 spot, is Haruki Murakami. I love him, but at the same time, sometimes I don't love him. And that's why I didn't want to include him in my top 10 list, because I always have to be in the right mindset and the right mood to read some of his books. Whereas for my top 10 list, pretty much I can read those authors at any point in life and enjoy them. Whereas for him, even though I do love a lot of his books, I do have to be in the right mood. So for that reason, he comes in at number 11, just outside of my top 10 list.